Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2022 Legatum Institute Courage and Journalism Award ceremony. My name's Alistair Masson. I've had the enormous privilege of overseeing this year's award with the help of two great colleagues, Juan Pablo Hernandez and Daisy Vanderput. We're honoured to have a stellar array of panellists taking part in tonight's event, including hopefully two of the awards judges. Christina Lamb, Chief Foreign Correspondent of the Sunday Times, is currently detained at an airport and hopefully on her way to join us very soon. We're also joined by Mike Thomson, International Correspondent of the BBC, Bill Neely, former Chief Global Correspondent at NBC News, Dominique Van Heerden, Senior Foreign Producer at Sky News, and Azzurra Moores, Campaigns Officer at Reporters Without Borders. The Legatum Institute is a public policy think tank based right here in London. Our work focuses on understanding what drives prosperity. That doesn't just mean what drives economic growth. It means understanding the features that are integral to free societies. Press freedom and personal freedom are in many ways synonymous. A free and independent media is of paramount importance to our liberty, to our security, and to our prosperity. It ensures that people are informed. It exposes the truth, and crucially, it holds those in power to account. The genesis of this award was the appalling murder of the renowned Maltese investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia in 2017. Daphne's son Paul, who sadly cannot be with us tonight, was a member of our team at the Institute, and in consultation with him and other members of Daphne's family, we created this award with two aims. The first was to honour her extraordinary legacy. During a remarkable 30-year career, Daphne had become a figurehead for journalistic integrity in Malta and beyond. Her running commentary blog shone a unique spotlight on Maltese politics, exposing corruption with her characteristic bravery and integrity. Her murder shocked Malta to its very core. It was met with widespread public protest by people rightly outraged at such a cynical ploy to silence a critic of the powerful. 5 years after her death, the reverberations of Daphne's murder are still being felt. Under intense pressure from Daphne's family and colleagues, the Maltese government finally agreed to launch a public inquiry into her murder in December 2019. And the following month, Prime Minister Joseph Muscat announced his resignation in the face of widespread allegations of corruption within his administration. To date, one of the three suspects implicated in her death has been jailed, and just last week, another confessed to his involvement in the killing and promised to implicate those who had ordered the killing. Since its inception, the Courage and Journalism Award has been bestowed on some truly remarkable reporters. These include Slovakian journalist Jan Kuciak, who was murdered in 2018, aged just 27, following his investigative reporting of corruption, which revealed links between the country's political elite and organised crime. And Raed Ferez, founder and director of the independent radio station Radio Fresh, who was shot and killed along with a colleague by unknown gunmen in 2018 while on his way to cover a protest. Ferez had been targeted on numerous occasions before, including being abducted and tortured by Al-Qaeda militants. And Mexican journalist Maria Elena Ferral Hernandez, the co-founder of the website El Quinto Poder, whose work on corruption amongst local politicians led directly to her murder in 2020. Alongside honouring Daphne's extraordinary legacy, we created the award to shine a spotlight on the intolerable risks that journalists are facing today. Those risks are both increasing and evolving. The Legatum Prosperity Index reports that freedom of speech has declined in 3/4 of the countries around the world in the past decade. Meanwhile, it also shows that physical repression of journalists has increased in 3/4 of countries. We are all too familiar with the impact of these trends. Worldwide, around 1,000 journalists have now been killed since 2020. The deaths of many of these, such as Jamal Khashoggi and Marie Colvin, rightly make the headlines, but far too many do not. But what unites all of them is a growing culture of impunity. Too few of these deaths result in investigations. even fewer in prosecutions. To give us a sense of the threats facing journalists today, we've put together this short film.
Global press freedom is being threatened more than at any time since the Cold War. It has never been more important, and yet is something that too many has taken for granted. According to the Legatum Prosperity Index, freedom of speech and access to information has declined in every region of the world during the past decade, with 120 countries seeing a stark deterioration. Across the globe, journalist safety, freedom from government censorship, political diversity of media perspectives, and freedom of opinion and expression have all been declining sharply over the last 10 years. In recent years, we have also seen journalists being personally targeted as a result of their investigative work, including the tragic murders of several high-profile journalists such as Jamal Khashoggi, Mary Colvin, and Daphne Caruana Galizia. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, more than 1,000 journalists have been killed since 2010. The Middle East and North Africa remains the most dangerous region in the world to be a journalist due to conflict, particularly Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. More recently, since the Russian army invaded Ukraine in February, 15 journalists have been killed reporting on the ground. However, 2/3 of the journalists who have lost their lives since 2010 have died in countries that are at peace. China, Colombia, Algeria, Honduras, India, the Philippines, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia are but a few countries where journalists continue to face threats to their lives. Particularly Afghanistan had seen a significant increase of its journalists killed and threatened since the government collapsed to the Taliban. Sadly, in many countries today there is still significant state-sponsored censorship of the press and media. This has manifested itself in an alarming rise in the number of journalists imprisoned for speaking out. In 2021, 488 journalists were behind bars according to Reporters Without Borders, the highest number of journalists imprisoned globally since records began. In China alone, over 100 journalists are known to be currently detained in conditions that pose a threat to their lives. Belarus and Hong Kong are the latest examples of the complete erosion of freedom of speech by brute force despite remarkable civil resistance. Around the world, media freedoms continue to suffer from a rise of authoritarian regimes, a decrease in democratic guarantees, a rise in polarization and repressive policies. More than ever, we need renewed international focus on improving press freedoms. The work of the Legatum Institute shows why a free and independent media is so fundamental to prosperity. It empowers people by ensuring they are informed and able to debate critical issues. It emboldens individuals to speak truth to power and to hold leaders to account. And it provides essential scrutiny and accountability of decision-making at all levels and in all sectors. We owe the men and women who risk and have given their lives for these fundamental values a great debt. We condemn those who seek to target and silence reporters for telling the stories that need to be told. And we stand with journalists all over the world in the pursuit of freedom, justice, and truth.
To understand some of these trends, I'd like to invite our first panel up to the stage. Could I ask Azzurra, Mike, and Bill to take their seats? Thank you. Seamless transition. You should all, I think if you can just pop them over your head. The microphone's just behind you. That should help us all to hear you.
Way around. No. Like, there we go.
Maybe try the other way, back to front.
These microphones are a first test.
I was going to come to you first, Bill. So.
Okay.
Does that work?
Yeah, that'll do.
If I can come to you first, Bill, the video mentioned that the conditions for journalists are now arguably more difficult than at any time since the Cold War. You famously were one of the people covering the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I think you said it was one of your the highlights of your journalistic career. How do you think the risks that journalists are facing have evolved in that time? And why has the job become quite so dangerous as it is today?
Well, I think these are the best of times and the worst of times to be a journalist. I mean, so exciting, and yet I think the dangers have never been greater from all kinds of actors. And I don't want to paint 1989, or indeed when I was in Northern Ireland, where I began as a journalist, as any kind of golden era. And yet in 30 years of violence in Northern Ireland, only one journalist was killed. Obviously, Lara McKee was killed more recently. But I think probably a few things have changed since 1989. And again, I don't want to paint it in any kind of golden colors, because when I was covering the fall of the Soviet Union, the Azerbaijani soldiers who were firing at me when I was with the Armenians didn't know I was a journalist. However, I think, let me call it's a horrible phrase, but the rise of non-state actors like ISIS, who just see journalists as fair game. The growth of asymmetric warfare has, I think, made the position of journalists just a little bit more dangerous, so that even Stephen Sotloff, who was steeped in Arab culture, who spoke good Arabic, was beheaded. He was fair game. I think allied to that and parallel to that is authoritarian leaders, from Vladimir Putin through Donald Trump to Bolsonaro in Brazil to President Obrador in Mexico, who have railed against journalists, who believe that those who do not speak with them are against them, enemies of the people, as Donald Trump put it. We'll speak later more about Mexico, but President Obrador has spoken more than 70 times against journalists, in the most brutal way, in a country where I would take exception to the video saying Mexico is a peaceful country. It ain't. There's a war there. I mean, more than 250,000 people have been killed in that country, and so many of them are journalists. I mean, the third thing I might point to is the growth of social media. I know social media gets a bad name, but somehow I think it amplifies what a journalist says and the risks to a journalist. In the old days, Mike, probably when you and I were hitting a manual typewriter in the days before the internet or anything else, your article was seen in a newspaper, but if people didn't see your article, then they didn't see it. Whereas today, you can get an article very, very quickly, and people on social media can be very, very angry. And not only that, they can't just see your article, they can trace you. And they can trace you very easily. So I think the growth of the internet, good thing, bad thing, but of course for journalists it just increases the risk. So, I would point to all those things. And again, I don't want to paint 1989 as any kind of golden era, because after 89 came the Balkan Wars, and many of our tribe, were killed in Bosnia, in Kosovo. In fact, I remember when I was going into Prizren, when the NATO attack began, 2 German correspondents that I was with were lured away by pro-Serbian forces with the promise that they were going to be shown mass graves, and they were both murdered. There was a deliberate targeting of journalists then and many times in the past.
Azzurra, if I can turn to you next, and perhaps it's an opportunity just to pick up on what Bill said about Mexico. Reporters Without Borders has been doing a huge amount of work to highlight the growing number of journalists that are being targeted and killed in countries that are supposed to be at peace. Mm-hmm. Can you give us a sense of where we're seeing this most? And Mexico is an obvious example, but also perhaps a sense of what is driving that trend.
Yeah, I mean, when we sort of were discussing this beforehand, I was in complete agreement. For years at Reporters Without Borders, we've said more journalists are being killed in countries that are at peace than in any other country. And I was going through our statistics today just to refresh everything, maybe just to update you that so far this year, tragically, we have 30 journalists and 2 media workers that have been killed. I mean, we're only in July, so that's already appalling. But actually, this year that shift hasn't happened, because we've seen 8 journalists so far killed in Ukraine. So I was thinking, well, actually, what's the case? What's happened? And I think there probably is a point that over the last few years we've seen a decline in the number of wars. So certainly, as you say, Bill, I mean, Mexico is a country that a huge number of people have killed, but typically we would call it a country that is at peace because there is no level of serious conflict. And the number of journalists that are killed in Mexico is absolutely outstanding. It's a country that is of huge concern and also takes no international accountability for these deaths. There's total impunity for all of these crimes. So yes, I think it's a really tricky one because for years, as you said, we've been saying more journalists are killed at peace. But actually, I'm thinking this year, 2022, that isn't so much the case. And I'm almost quite tragically worried to say that I think the number of journalists that are killed in Ukraine will probably continue to go up as this conflict is going on. So certainly, I think maybe towards the end of 2022, we'll have to reevaluate that line.
Thank you. And Mike, you've been reporting from hotspots around the world for a number of years. How have you seen these threats, the threats that journalists are facing in the course of their everyday work, evolving over the course of your career? Are there any particular countries that you would point to as being areas where they are in particular threat and perhaps underreported, whereas to Azzurra's point, lots of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment is being reported? Are there any places that are going slightly under the radar?
Well, I think going back to what Bill was saying earlier, in the Middle East for quite a long time now, it's been impossible as a journalist to be neutral because you're seen as part and parcel of the Western forces or even the aid agencies who themselves aren't seen as neutral either. And I remember, in fact, in Iraq, going way back 2005, the first time I really saw this was when I was trying to interview people in Basra to get an idea of what they thought post-Saddam, with the elections coming, society was now like, and was all the upheaval worthwhile. And I was talking to shopkeepers saying, so, what's your view? And the shopkeepers telling me, well, I feel now Saddam was gone, and then I'm being moved by the British Army who were with me. I'm being moved, almost sort of carried when I didn't move. And I said to the lieutenant who was with me, look, I'm trying to do an interview here. I know you've got your own orders and how this should be conducted, but I can't talk to people like this. And he said to me, look, every window above us here, all these windows, there could be a sniper in there, and you will be target number one. You may think you're a journalist, you're impartial, you're just here to report what's happening. But he said, apart from the view about journalists, which has changed, there's also the fact that you've got a huddle of soldiers around you. You're a VIP as far as the person with the rifle is concerned, because we're protecting you. They don't care who you are, but first they go for you. And he said that will be without doubt, and probably before we can do much. But if we keep you moving, we're lessening the chances. And before that, I'd done a lot of reporting in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And it was rare that I found myself to be a target and other colleagues I worked with there to be targets. You could be in the wrong place at the wrong time, of course. That's war, but you weren't deliberately targeted. And that all changed. I think also more and more leaders of various countries have become aware of the power of information suppression and distortion. And I think in a way we as Western journalists get it comparatively lightly. I mean, I remember being in just a couple of years ago in Darfur and being told that even though we'd been given a proper visa and we could report all around Darfur, it was getting more and more tense. So we were in El Fasher and we were told, travel where you like, and suddenly we make plans to move and the army hears about it and the UN comes rushing in saying, don't go anywhere because otherwise you'll be arrested. And we're called into the Army HQ, and I mean, when I said it's much worse for locals and people like me, in the end this landed up being a bit amusing. I was taken by the senior officer. He said, come, Mr. Thomson, let me show you to the grave of a British man, in a most sort of, worrying fashion. It turned out this was all quite innocent. There was an airman who had been shot down, and he was in this grave. It wasn't actually, I don't think, an implied threat to me, although I was warned not to disobey what I'd been told. But it's the local journalists you hear about. you take Egypt as an example, not just Sudan, but the number of people in jail, it's horrendous. And where else people like me or Bill may be sort of, we may be kicked out of the country, we may be roughed up a little, whatever, but it doesn't usually, although sadly it does sometimes, of course, bombs and bullets, but go further than that. But the local journalists, who often people don't hear about, it's not thanks to statistics that you're gathering, for instance, or Amnesty or whoever. But it's definitely taken a big turn for the worse.
That actually provides a nice segue into our next question, Azzurra. I was going to ask you about the fact that there is an alarming trend, which Reporters Without Borders has been key to highlight, about the number of reporters being imprisoned as another means of targeting them. Could you give us a bit of a sense of where we're seeing this happen most frequently? Mike, you mentioned Egypt. I'm sure there are some other examples. And also just some of the sort of psychology behind this trend.
Yeah, I mean, you gave a brilliant statistic that we have in your video. 488 journalists were jailed last year, which is an outrageous number, and it's certainly the highest number of journalists we've ever seen jailed since we've been keeping track of these sort of statistics. There are three main countries that are really the biggest culprits for this. China being the biggest one. China is the largest jailer of journalists worldwide. But two other countries, Myanmar and Belarus, which I think is a really interesting sort of set of countries, because actually we know what's happened in both those countries. We've seen an uprising since then. In answer to your question as to why this is happening, something that we've noticed, particularly with journalists being jailed, is a lot of times we're no longer seeing just, the anchor jailed or the frontline journalist, the journalist that's in front of the camera, but we're seeing journalists from the newsroom, we're seeing producers. Really interestingly, we're also seeing people like accountants who work for news organisations being jailed as well. So the idea is that once you jail one member of a team, one large organisation can no longer function. On top of that, another really interesting statistic is that we've seen more women jailed than ever before. Why? Well, I think the only answer is we're seeing a lot more women being part of a larger form of resistance, particularly in places like Belarus, particularly in places like Myanmar. So, yes, it's a really interesting statistic, because why? And I think the answer is because it causes larger problems, but it doesn't mean that whether it's the state or the individual actors are doing something as severe and as almost targeted as killing the individual journalist. So it's causing a disruption, it's an attack on press freedom, but it's not an attack on one individual person. It's an attack on press freedom as a principle and as an idea in general.
Mike, and maybe this is also a question, Bill, you might want to comment on as well. Another tactic we're seeing is an alarming rise in the number of vexatious lawsuits brought against journalists as another means of trying to end investigations that are proving problematic for somebody. I think Daphne was battling something like 50 such lawsuits at the time of her death. How big an issue do you think this has become, and to what extent have we still got a long way to go as sort of national governments and multilateral organisations, for example, to start to address it?
Yes, a very serious threat, because obviously if journalists, particularly in Western countries where there's things are set up for this type of action, there's money there from corporate lawyers to step in, and they know it'll make a lot of editors a lot more nervous. I've been involved in a few lawsuits which happily have ended well, but there's sometimes even some developing countries have used Western lawyers to bring court action against the BBC, and I've been involved in a few of those. Yes, it is intimidating, and sometimes it's trying to find something, just something they can get you on, something which the BBC or ITV or whoever you're with, Sky, will have to accept. Okay, well, yeah, maybe they could have done a bit more like this, or a bit more of that, or a bit less of the other, and then it's proclaimed to be case stood up. And it can be seriously damaging, and particularly for newspapers, many of whom are really struggling. Obviously in some countries in the Middle East and Africa, for instance, where I know best, they can just be closed down. I mean, if the government decides, we've decided you've lied, we're going to use whatever, whether you're insulting the president, a common one, or obviously fake news, as in the Russian example, we're entitled to close you down. And it means that it's that sort of self-censorship that can be generated either from the journalist who doesn't want to go through this, and I know myself going through each occasion, it's about 18 months of uncertainty. It is intimidating, and of course your employer, and of course there are many other levers that can be pulled with your employer, your organisation, to other than just lawsuits.
Maybe something that's also worth adding about Daphne's case is, in many examples of these lawsuits, we're seeing really rich sort of businessmen advancing these lawsuits, Russian businessmen, etc. In Daphne's case, we were actually seeing government ministers advancing these cases. So you had the Minister for Economy, but you also had the Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat. And he, to this day, is one of the few people who refuses to drop the lawsuit, which is postmortemly inherited by her family. So, 5 years on from her murder, Joseph Muscat is still suing her children. So in instances like this, now this isn't the case in the UK, these laws can't be inherited, but certainly in Malta, the way in which sort of vexatious lawsuits work is they leave this really awful burden for a family who's, one, grieving, and two, trying to still find any sort of criminal accountability. So it's really quite shocking.
And difficult, isn't it? We can say that news organisations should have more backbone, but if you're facing the wrath of the state, whether it's Russia or inside the European Union, let's not forget Viktor Orban's Hungary, which is supposed to be signing up to everything the EU stands for. He and his mates control all the newspapers, all the TV stations. He's just been re-elected. His campaign speech was on every television station every night. His opponent got some time, 5 minutes. That was it. So it's all very well saying, journalists need to be, editors need to be strong, but if you're facing that kind of pressure, it's tough.
Bill, if I can just turn to you once again to just pick up on the issue of Mexico in particular. It is now notorious as one of the most difficult and dangerous places in the world to be a journalist. Can you give us a sense of just how dangerous it is, and what kind of tactics are journalists encountering on a daily basis in terms of intimidation and targeting?
I don't want to paint myself as any kind of expert on Mexico, but I did go there half a dozen times, and in fact to Juarez and Tijuana, which in both cases at one point were the most dangerous cities in the world. And in fact, I was in contact today with the man I worked with, Vicente Calderon, in Juarez, and I said, what's it like in Mexico today? And he said, it is worse today than it was in 2006, and that's really when all of this crap began. He said, 2 of my friends were murdered within a week at the start of this year. 2 women journalists in Tijuana. So far, we've had 11 journalists, as I understand it, killed in Mexico, which is second only to Ukraine. So again, going back to my point, I understand the idea that it's a peaceful country. I don't feel that for journalists it's peaceful. So what do they go through? I would say that every single journalist in Mexico has been intimidated. Certainly every single journalist I met had been intimidated. And that goes from simple threats. Someone that you don't know saying to you, you know you shouldn't be doing that and you know the consequences of doing it, don't you? To being hacked, which sometimes you don't know about, to having your house broken into and your files stolen, and often a very simple note left on your table, to being blackmailed, quite direct, to being beaten up, even more direct, to being kidnapped and then released, very scary, to having, again, going back to threats to your wife, your partner, your husband, your children, not good at all. And then there is murder and just the state of terror that Mexico is. My daughter has just had her honeymoon in Mexico, had a wonderful time, 3 weeks of just bliss. And I didn't say a word about what Mexico, when you lift the stone, what Mexico is like. But what is Mexico like? You're driving along a highway to go into your office in the morning, and there are headless bodies swinging from a bridge above you that people are too scared to cut down. There are execution videos on YouTube of people you know, and they're long and they're just as bad as ISIS, because the cartels quickly copied. Actually, I'm not sure who copied who, because the cartels have been doing this for a very, very long time. So, the situation for Mexican journalists is dire, and they're caught in a no-win situation. Some cartels want you to publicize things about them, and some cartels do not. And at times you don't know, as an editor or a TV station, you don't know what to do. So increasingly, over the last few years, people have been self-censoring, newspapers and TV stations, taking government press releases and police reports, and that's it. Removing journalists' names from bylines. Increasingly not covering it at all. So when I was there was the mother of all gunfights in a place called Reynosa over 2 weeks. 200 people were killed. 2 cartels were fighting each other with heavy weapons. There was not a word about that in a newspaper, on radio, on TV. Where was it reported? The Dallas Morning News. It's often American newspapers, San Diego, Dallas, that report these things because journalists are too scared. There is a chilling effect. The statistics, more than 100 journalists killed in Mexico in recent years. Yeah. They say it all.
Well, shocking statistics.
Yeah, count your blessings.
If I could just wrap up this first panel session with a question I'm going to sort of pose to all three of you simultaneously, if that's all right. How do we start leading a fight back to some of these trends in terms of what role can the news organisations themselves play? How can they be extending some of the safeguards they provide for their own reporters to the fixers and interpreters that are invaluable parts of the reporting mechanism? How do we raise awareness more broadly within governments about the importance of taking this issue on? Where should we? It's so complex and so multifaceted. Where should we start?
Are we starting with me?
Whoever would like to go first.
Right. You can start.
Where should we start? Who should we start with? Yes. It's a massive challenge. I thought when you said that initially, one thing that the BBC's done in the past was, I know as a colleague of mine in Sri Lanka a few years ago who was being put forward to replace the correspondent who'd left, and it turned out that when I talked to him and said, look, this job could be yours, you just need to do this, that, the other, and I could tell he wasn't hugely keen, and it was because of the threat. He said, it later came out, he said, look, either me or more likely one of my relatives will land up in the back of a white van, or they'll have an accident. And he said it's not so bad if there's at least 2 people, because he'd been handling the local language service, not the English service. Because he said they really care about international press coverage. They think they can deal with the local, but the international is a problem, so if I become that person. So he didn't want the job, and in the end, they had to appoint someone from Delhi to come down to do that, so from the region, but not Sri Lankan. So whether in some cases you unfortunately have to have somebody who's not from the area, and another international reporter, which is more of a break on the government doing things with them. I think it also needs a lot of pressure on the government each time these things happen. Although I have to say, when we've talked to some of the examples, if we look in Turkey, we look in Egypt, or we look in Myanmar, there often hasn't been a hell of a lot. The things that have been happening, which of course Reporters Without Borders will be noticing perhaps more than any of us, but it's often because so many other things are tied up, commercial things which stop the governments intervening, where they'll talk the talk but not actually walk the walk, and it's finding a way of, and perhaps public pressure to really stop them doing that.
It's the hardest question, because it's ultimately asking, certainly at RSF, what are we doing every day? I think for starters, events like this are really highlighting the names and the work and the life of those who've really tragically lost their lives. It has to be a continuous bare minimum. I think it's important about really understanding who has lost their life, how many people, what were the circumstances, so that first of all it's never forgotten. But I think you're completely right. I think there's a real need, one, for that international accountability, because governments are scared of other governments knowing what's going on in their country. And that's certainly something we see in places like Malta, for example, where there's been this real international pressure on the government. That's when the most changes have really happened. Secondly, it's about fighting impunity for those murders. So you mentioned in Daphne's case, I mean, we are hopefully, certainly by the end of this year, certainly by the end of next year, going to see some real tangible criminal accountability for the people that killed Daphne. And it's a really tricky case because so many people were involved. But once perpetrators of these crimes start to understand that actually they can't get away with it without criminal accountability, hopefully that's when we see some changes. But certainly really continuing and amplifying the people that have lost their lives. I mean, there's other things. There's all sorts of safety mechanisms which news organisations can do, and I think that's certainly not where I can speak best, but that real sense of criminal accountability, of international accountability, places like the ICC, really putting names to faces, I think that's ultimately where we'll start to see some change.
Yeah, it's pressure. From organisations like yours, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Article 19, all these great organisations. I was very heartened a couple of years ago when the Nobel Peace Prize was given to two journalists. In a sense, nothing to do with peace, but about values. One of them was Maria Ressa from the Philippines, where journalists have been killed in large numbers, and of course the other one was in Russia, in an independent newspaper that, like so many others, was pressured, closed down. So yes, I mean it is up to everyone. I feel politicians, of course, haven't done enough. As you said, they talk the talk, they don't walk the walk. I mean, these are war crimes. These are war crimes. However, we know from Ukraine how difficult it is to follow a war crime, to get the evidence, to nail the perpetrator. And again, going back to Mexico, you know, it's not just that journalists are murdered, it's that I think only about 1 in 10 and anyone is even arrested. And most of them aren't even investigated. Not even investigated. But how does anyone pressure President Obrador to do anything about that? This is tough.
Yeah. I think that's a good question to end on. That brings our first panel to an end. I'd like everyone just to give the panelists a quick round of applause. Thank you. The Courage in Journalism Award is a posthumous award. It honours journalists killed while telling the stories that so desperately needed to be told. This inevitably makes tonight something of a sombre affair. It also means that there is, by definition, no winner of tonight's award. This year, Mike, Christina were joined on our judging panel by The Telegraph's Con Coughlin and former FT journalist David Freud. Together, they considered 67 candidates, all of whom have been killed since the start of 2021. We felt that all should be featured as part of tonight's ceremony to honour their courage as well as their contribution. now like to invite our next panel onto the stage. Can I ask Mike and Bill to return, as Christina Stanley hasn't been able to make it from the airport, alongside Dominique. Thank you. Mike, if I can start with you, we're hugely grateful to you for once again being part of the judging panel for this year's award. Can you give us a sense of what struck you most about the candidates that we were looking at this year?
Well, going right across the board, it was quite exceptional. I mean, there were so many people who, in the path of doing their job, had lost their lives. Sometimes it was a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, which sadly can happen to any of us. But others had repeatedly followed stories that they knew were going to endanger their life. So that, I think, is the mark of true courage, when you know the danger you're facing. Many of them had been warned that if they carried on, they would be killed. Some had had attempts on their lives before. And in the case of journalists in Ukraine, the dangers were everywhere. But it did nothing to deter these people doing their job. Obviously, there's a degree in these situations of it's your country and you do what you can for it. But it was really moving. And in the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, marvellous. I mean, so many years of covering that conflict. And obviously, in the end, rather unsatisfactory ending to the outcome of this, of saying, oh, you know, maybe it could have just been unintentional, although probably shot by an Israeli bullet. But no, it's also hard. As you said, there are no winners, but there's an awful lot of inspiration from all of them.
Thank you. Dominique, if I can come to you next. We all will have noticed the large number of Ukrainian candidates in that video. You've spent a lot of time covering the recent conflict. Can you give us a sense of what life has been like on the front line there, and how it perhaps differs from other conflicts you've covered in your career?
Yeah, Ukraine has come onto all of our radars, excuse me, really in February, but that conflict, not the invasion, but the conflict has been going on since 2014, mostly focused around the Donbass. And that's when I started covering it. And from the outset, it was always a conflict where information war, which I know we'll talk a bit more about, was at the fore of it. That was there from the beginning. But what made the invasion in February a lot trickier, a lot more dangerous, I felt anyway, was the front line was very fluid. So in other conflicts, there's almost a predictability to where the front line could be. It's quite contained to a certain area, so you know you're going back and forth from the front line. Whereas especially around the areas around Kyiv, it was like anything could be a front line at any given point. So it, you know, in the case of our team, when we were very violently ambushed by Russian forces outside on the outskirts of Kyiv, we were only 15 minutes from our hotel. You know, we were right on the outskirts on a road we drove down just about 2 hours earlier, which wasn't part of the front line, which was suddenly part of the front line. So it was very, very difficult to predict. It's also difficult because the Ukrainian authorities are quite, you know, they're not that keen on embeds. They're not keen at all. Which means that a lot of the time you're trying to head forward as far as you can, as far as you safely can, with perhaps a military escort. But I think that's probably been the two big things. And also it's two nation states fighting with very, very, very heavy weaponry. You know, I covered a bit of Mosul with ISIS, and that was a nation state and its allies versus an insurgency, a terrorist organization. But two nations with a lot of powerful weapons. It's very much an artillery war, which makes it very, very, very difficult to get to the front. Yeah.
Thank you. Bill, if I can turn to you, there's also still an alarming number of candidates from that video from Afghanistan. Just how far backwards have we gone, in your view, when it comes to the lives journalists are leading over there since the return of the Taliban last year?
Well, I mean, Afghanistan has has always been a dangerous place for journalists. Your point about a fluid front line, where's the front line in Afghanistan exactly? I know when I was embedded with British and American troops, the front line was as soon as you stepped out the front gate. I was embedded at one point with the Taliban, and we were attacked by locals. Where was the front line then? The Taliban saved my ass. They beat the shit out of the locals. So where is the danger? And certainly in the opening days of any conflict, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, or Ukraine, definitely those early days are absolutely perilous, because there's nothing more dangerous than a fluid front line. I mean, a man I hired for ITN, Fred Nerak, was killed. Well, he's dead. His body has actually never been recovered. Another interesting statistic when we talk about journalists who've been killed, there is a whole section in most of the websites, if you go to killed, disappeared. And that's especially true of Mexico, and you know what's happened to them because they ain't coming back. So Fred and Terry Lloyd, who everyone will have heard of he was ITN's most experienced war correspondent. They died in those opening hours and days in a fluid front line between. And remember what a battleground is. It's where two massive forces want to kill each other. And we put ourselves in there, so we know what we're doing. And yet, no matter how much experience you have, think Marie Colvin, think Tim Hetherington, no matter how cautious you are, Kurt Schork was a man I knew in Kosovo, a very, very cautious former lawyer who became a correspondent for Reuters and the New York Times, a man who was incredibly cautious in Kosovo, went to Sierra Leone, went up the wrong road at the wrong time. As you said, it was okay the day before, but as the military say, every village is its own war, and every day the war is different. So you can be okay on a Monday, and you can be screwed on a Tuesday. And you can be complacent, you can be, I mean, we've all got long experience at war zones, but you can have an air of, oh yeah, been there, done that, I understand what's happening, but you don't know what you don't know. You don't know that your translator has plans to kill you later that day. So it's just very difficult. Sorry, that's straying a bit from your Afghanistan question, but it's just tough, yeah.
Dominique, if I can just return to you. I mean, we're fascinated by your insights about the situation in Ukraine and what it's been like for reporters. To what extent do you feel like reporters have themselves been deliberately targeted by Russian forces as an attempt to somehow influence or shape the narrative of the conflict?
I think, look, I have to say, I think in our case, I genuinely don't believe we were targeted for being journalists. I think we were targeted for being in the wrong place at the wrong time on the wrong road. And they were targeting civilians. It was a civilian vehicle. I think we were just targeted for that. I don't think there was any way they could have known necessarily we were journalists. But we did see it, for example, in Max Levin's case. He was a journalist, he was clearly marked as a journalist, and he was still killed as a journalist. So certainly there is going to be that targeting going on. The information war, though, in Ukraine is really managed from Moscow at the end of the day. It's very, very top down. So if they're managing that narrative, it doesn't really matter as long as they have Russian general public support, which the government does have in very overwhelming numbers inside Russia, because their narrative is the only narrative on television in Russia. Whatever people see outside of Russia, whatever we put out as Sky or the BBC puts out or ITN or the NBC or whatever it might be, that is outside of their narrative, but it's not really playing to their main audience. So I think in that sense, foreign journalists and what they do, well, all it is fake news, right? Even our ambush. I mean, I cannot tell you the amount of people who say, yeah, no, great faking that, guys, that was great. It's like, what? You know, it is like this whole idea of fake news is now just being used as a defense of, yeah, we don't agree with what they're saying, so we'll say it's false, it's incorrect, it couldn't possibly have happened. And so I think from that point of view, yes, Russia as a state is is doing it. Ukraine has an information war of its own, don't forget. Zelensky with his nightly address and his military fatigues and combat gear, and this grassroots movement on social media getting international support. So it's an information war going both ways. I would just say probably the one in Ukraine is a little bit grassroots up, whereas the in Russia it's certainly starting with the little green men in Crimea in 2014, top down, I would say.
And Mike, just to pick up on the issue of information war, we're seeing some states committing huge resources into becoming really quite specialised in the conduct of information war. To what extent do you think that's changed the nature of modern warfare? And to what extent do you think countries like the UK are somehow running to catch up, in effect? And what more do we need to be doing to wise up? And what role maybe within that dynamic is there for news organisations themselves to help call out fake news and misinformation?
Well, I sort of wonder in some ways, I mean, obviously, propaganda, as it would have been called before, as fake news has been around a very long time. When you go back to the Second World War, if you take the BBC, we're heavily involved with the government, as it was seen to be a time of national emergency, of course, as a war. And information has long been known to be power, and the control of it to be enormously important. And of course, as we were just hearing, say with Moscow, yes, it's done quite well in phases at trying to get people to believe what it says. And of course, as has also been said, it controls media output mainly. I mean, the BBC was stopped broadcasting there after having various services blocked, but is now broadcasting again, and people can get access. In China, more difficult. But obviously the bottom line, I suppose, is, it's not what is true that matters, it's what people believe to be true. And of course, Donald Trump was such a big one behind that. He knew that if you put your word out to people who generally hold your sort of worldview, it doesn't matter that it's not true, because they've absorbed it, they believe it, they feel it in their gut, and on they go. They're not going to check on the BBC or ITN to see whether, hang on, is that really true, or ask where did they get those facts from. They just go with it, and particularly when there's no other alternatives. I think in terms of the social media and the use of bots and I mean, we know all about the accusations about elections in the US being controlled, the referendum in the UK allegedly being influenced by Russia. If those are true, and no one's proved categorically that they are, those two examples, then I think we have got a bit of catching up to do, yes.
I think, just going back to Iraq and Afghanistan, I think the British government, and especially the British military, were absolutely appalling at information warfare. I mean, you would think the British military would know better, but they didn't. I mean, you spoke earlier about your frustrations with the British military. I remember being embedded on countless occasions with the British military, saying, you are losing this information war. Try to give us access. We're not necessarily your enemies. I mean, this is an uncomfortable thing to say, but if you think that the military is here with their own sets of preoccupations, and the media is here with its sets of preoccupations, there is actually a point in the middle where we can both get along, where we can both get what we want. We get access to the front line. They get their troops and their mission shown back home, which we all know helps their recruitment and everything else, whatever it is they want. But what we want is access to the front line. And I was saying to them, look, I can click on videos here from the Taliban or from the Mehdi army in southern Baghdad or Basra, and I can get stuff like that, and you're giving me nothing. And they couldn't understand that it was they couldn't understand the concept of information warfare. I mean, it beggared belief. So I think, actually, to slightly balance the books, I think what the governments did just before Russia invaded Ukraine was very good. They were using information to warn the public, to tell the public, to preempt what the Russians were going to do next. Not that that helps us in any way, but I think they can be incredibly slow. You know, governments and armies are like huge aircraft carriers. They're very powerful, but they're incredibly difficult to maneuver and to turn, especially when they're under fire.
There's one thing too I did find in Iraq with the two, you mentioned the US and the UK, it seemed like the UK, you couldn't go anywhere pretty much outside the main base that had any danger to it, because they were petrified if someone did get injured, it's all going to be very bad press back in the UK, particularly at the point I was there. Or with the Americans, I said to this GI, can I come with you in this tank? Is there any room? He said, well, see, you got a pass? And I said, yeah. He said, well, get in. And then we'd be going about 10 minutes. It's extreme opposite to the British. We come under fire. They all leap out and start returning fire. And I'm thinking, do I stay here? Do I? But it was like, you've signed an agreement. You're responsible for yourself. And the complete opposite to the British approach.
I wish Christina Lamb was here, because she and I shared an experience within weeks of each other. When the British Army, or indeed any army, wants you to be there and they want to use you, they'll use you. And as I've said, sometimes that's okay. So both Christina and I went to Sangin in Iraq. We were both attacked in my case, within minutes of landing by the Taliban. I mean, very, very serious attack, because the base there was being attacked night and day. But why were we there? Because the paratroop regiment and indeed the whole battalion and the commander of special forces wanted us to be there. He wanted the government and the country to know that this was not a cakewalk. And therefore, they used us. Luckily, we survived. We were okay with that being used. So yeah, I mean, when they want you, boy do they want you. Yeah.
I think just to second what you said, it even goes back just to last year with the fall of Kabul on the 15th of August. You know, our team was stuck inside the Baron Hotel. The Brits were managing the cordon, saying absolutely you can't go out front. You can't. It's like, no, but we can, because this is a hotel. It's not a military barracks. And it's like, and we've paid to be at the hotel, so technically we can do what we want. And it went on and on for about 24 hours with, you know, special forces getting very uptight in the paras. And then, you know, one big argument later, and they started to ease off. I think a lot of it had to do with them being very upset with how the Foreign Office was managing what was going on, and that they were being lumped with the problem outside the Baron Hotel and getting all the bad press. So they thought, okay, well, fine. Yeah, we're going to, Boris Johnson in number 10 keeps saying it's a very organized withdrawal and it's all going very well. Let's just let these journalists out to go see what they find and see what happens. And yeah, within 24 hours, another group of soldiers were in and the whole effort started picking up. So I think it's, as you say, Bill, and as you say, it's a little bit of give and take when you're dealing with the authorities. Yeah.
If I can just come to you, Dominique, for the final question. Ukraine has obviously it's been such a salient issue in the last few months. I think everyone in this room would share a sense that the invasion has been a complete outrage and something to be resisted, and the Ukrainian people have shown a huge amount of resilience and have won so many plaudits and had so much admiration for that. How hard has it been to maintain your own journalistic integrity when it comes to reporting a conflict which seems, at least morally, so one-sided like that?
I think that you can only you report what you see where you are. I think that's a general good rule of thumb. I am one of the few younger journalists these days who is on social media. I don't look at it to inform our team, what our team does. Stuart Ramsey, the correspondent I work with at Sky, he's very experienced like these guys here, and so he brings that good heavyweight amount of experience. I prefer not to indulge in social media, not to go into the narratives that are being built by press releases, by Twitter, by Instagram stories, by TikTok, whatever it might be, but instead just use your sense on the ground to work out what is going on at any point in time where you are. And if we were shot by Ukrainian forces, it would have been hard, but we would have said we were shot by Ukrainian forces. I mean, that is a fact. You report what you see in that moment. It's very difficult with with this war with Russia, because the Russians are not allowing any access into their areas. No access, Mariupol, Zaporizhia, where they're sort of parting control, Kherson, no access. So you might have some who say to you, well, do you want to tell Russia's side of the story? It's like, well, okay, sure, but how? So we're given access on the Ukrainian side, that is what we do. And you're absolutely right in saying that, let's say, the people's champion in this war in the West, because I would say Russia has a lot of support in parts of Africa, India, China, etc., a huge population. But in this particular war, I think I'm always aware, especially after being shot at and almost killed by the Russians, I'm a bit aware that I need to just stick to what we all know and what we all try and do, which is show the world what you see at that point in time and in that moment. And sometimes it corresponds with or confirms what the authorities are saying, and sometimes it is completely the opposite. But you go with it, whichever way it is.
That's great. I think we're going to have to wrap this final panel up there. But thank you very much, everybody, and please give them a quick round of applause. Thank you. As you will all appreciate, determining a single recipient for tonight's award has been both a challenging and a sobering process. Over the past few weeks and months, our judging panel has reviewed the profiles of all 67 candidates for the award. A huge number of them have been repeatedly threatened in a deliberate attempt to warn them off their stories. Some by cartels, some by Al-Shabaab, some by the Taliban. Despite such threats, these men and women have continued to do their work, to interview sources, to investigate, to publish, to film, and to broadcast. Reducing this long and distinguished list to a single recipient has not been an easy process. But our judges felt that one journalist stood out for their determination to continue reporting despite the appalling dangers from the front line in Ukraine and the continuing threats from Russian forces and the Kremlin. For their commitment to bringing the truth to the world, and for their courage and for their integrity. It therefore gives me enormous pride to announce that Max Levin has been named as the recipient of the 2022 Courage in Journalism Award. Max was a leading Ukrainian photojournalist who had documented the conflict in Ukraine since the Russian incursion of 2014. His work had featured a range of outlets, including the BBC, Wall Street Journal, Reuters, and Time magazine. Though the precise circumstances of his death remain unclear, evidence suggests that Max was abducted along with a friend by Russian forces near Kyiv on 13th of March. His body was found in a village 3 kilometers north of the city on the 1st of April. According to the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office, he had been shot once in the chest and twice in the head, all while unarmed and wearing a press jacket. A subsequent investigation cited evidence that he was almost certainly tortured while under interrogation by Russian soldiers. During an interview just before his death, Max was asked why he did what he did. He replied, "I often ask myself that. What makes me come back? But I continue to because I should. It's a kind of duty and responsibility for those brave people who are out there fighting. Also to show other people that there's a war happening and that it's real. I want to show that these are people who are here to protect all of us." Max was not only a journalist of extraordinary courage, he was also a journalist of extraordinary integrity. In the same interview, he remarked, "The information war is no less dirty than the one going on in the fields. We have to be less afraid about telling the truth. After all, making something fake is pretty easy. So it's not a matter of work or method. Ultimately, it's a matter of conscience." In recognition of his bravery in reporting from the front line, Max was posthumously awarded the Order of Courage, Ukraine's highest civilian honor, by President Volodymyr Zelensky. As well as being a pioneering photojournalist, Max was also a father of 4, and we were honoured to hear from Max's ex-wife Ina, who shared her reflections on this extraordinary man.
I'm Inna Vranica. I'm a journalist. I'm an ex-wife of Max Levin and mother of his youngest son. For me, he was not only part of my family, he was a big part of my life because we used to work together and we shared the same views on journalism and on society as well. Макс був не просто журналістом, він був документалістом. І він намагався зробити такий документалізм у чистому вигляді. Тобто найточнішу передачу того, що відбувається. І, власне, за це його цінують як колеги, так і ті, кого безпосередньо він знімав. Навіть коли Макс не був безпосередньо на лінії фронту, він все одно продовжував висвітлювати події і все пов'язане з війною. Що його надихало? Це, можливо, частина історії української, це, можливо, дух спротиву, який був серед українців і який є зараз ще більше, ніж у 2014 році. І, власне, це і надихало його те, що звичайні люди, he never was trying to ask somebody to change position or to do something. He usually waited unless it happened. If it won't happen, okay, it won't happen. So the main thing for him was to shoot in a real documentary way. І коли вже почалося вторгнення Росії повномасштабне, власне, тоді Макс був на Донбасі. І він намагався з різних боків показати життя там, що воно перетворилося, тобто впродовж 8 років. І коли почався наступ на Київ безпосередньо, а Макс народився під Києвом, то він вирішив приїхати сюди. В деталях ми можемо тільки здогадуватися, але те, що це було вбивство, тому мені важко уявити, що би він сказав. Я розумію, що тут мав би бути він. І оце одне речення я не можу сказати. Мені важко уявити, що би сказав тут Макс, тому що на цьому місці мав би бути він. Але те, що він працював не для нагороди, а для нього найважливіше було, що саме він робить і як він це робить. І саме тому його кадри настільки цінні, що вони є справді документальною фіксацією нашого життя. І, напевно, для нього так само було важливо те, що це бачать, його кадри бачать люди не тільки в Україні, а й в усьому світі. І це найважливіше.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes tonight's award ceremony. I'd like to thank you all for coming here this evening and thank our panel for sharing their insights and opinions. As we leave here tonight, I want to impart one simple message. Effective journalism has never been more important. Tonight's event has highlighted the courage shown by journalists on a daily basis, often in the face of intolerable risks, often for little or no pay. So what makes these people do what they do? Quite simply, It's because it matters. For each of them, this is not a job, it is a vocation. Max, like Daphne and other previous recipients of the award, have set us an extraordinary example. We must also view their deaths as a call to action, to work together to end the culture of impunity, to make those who think about targeting journalists think twice. That would be a hell of a thing. Thank you.